I had been planning the hike for weeks, studying maps, checking weather forecasts, and preparing my gear meticulously. The trail I chose was one of the more challenging ones in the region, a stretch through dense forest that climbed steep ridges and crossed rocky streams. It was early spring, the snow had mostly melted, but patches still lingered in shaded hollows and on the north-facing slopes. The day I started, the sun was weak and pale, barely breaking through a blanket of thin clouds, casting a cold, diffuse light over the forest. I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with unease. There was something about the woods at this time of year that felt raw and untouched, alive in ways that cities could never be. I knew I would be alone, and that was part of why I did it. Alone, I could push myself, observe every detail, and confront the subtle threats and challenges the wilderness offered. I set off along the narrow trail, feeling the damp earth under my boots. The ground was soft in places, saturated from recent rain, and occasionally I had to step over gnarled roots that twisted like the veins of the forest itself. The trees were mostly tall pines and oaks, their branches tangled and low in some areas, forcing me to bend and duck as I walked. I carried a pack that felt heavier than usual because I had packed extra supplies: water, food, a first aid kit, extra layers, and a compact climbing rope in case the trail got too treacherous. Every few minutes, I checked my map and compass, making sure I was on the right path. GPS was patchy in this region, and I didn't want to rely on technology that might fail. The first couple of hours were fairly uneventful. Birds called occasionally from high in the canopy, and the occasional squirrel darted across the trail, stopping to look at me before disappearing into the underbrush. The forest smelled damp and earthy, with the faint, sharp scent of pine resin. The trail climbed steadily, and my legs began to burn with the effort, but I felt strong and capable. Around mid-morning, I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. The water was icy and clear, and I paused to take a drink and refill my water bottle. I rested for a few minutes, sitting on a rock near the edge of the stream, watching the water ripple over stones, listening to its soft gurgle. There was a quiet serenity here, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of everything else. The creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, even the faint hum of insects. I continued on, the trail rising more steeply now, winding up a ridge. The slope was uneven, with loose rocks and wet mud in places. I had to pay close attention to every step to avoid slipping. The further I climbed, the colder it got, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I noticed patches of snow lingering in the shade of the trees, slippery and deceptive. I tested each step carefully, planting my boots firmly before committing my weight. Around noon, the sun briefly broke through the clouds, casting long shadows on the ground, and the light revealed how steep the ridge truly was. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving. I reminded myself to take my time. Rushing here could be dangerous. About 2 hours later, I reached a narrow section of the trail that ran along a cliff face. The drop to my left was dizzying, at least 50 feet down, jagged rocks and sparse underbrush below. I hugged the mountainside, gripping roots and rocks for balance. The trail here was barely wide enough for 1 foot, and every misstep could be fatal. I felt my heart rate accelerate, not from exertion but from the awareness of the danger. The wind was stronger here, gusting across the ridge and pushing at me, trying to unbalance me. I moved slowly, keeping my center of gravity low, careful with every step. My legs shook slightly from tension and fatigue, and I had to pause to rest against the rock face, breathing heavily. I scanned the area below, trying to find anything to hold onto in case of a fall, but it was all sheer rock and broken soil. As I rounded a bend in the trail, the ground beneath me shifted slightly. I froze. A small section of loose soil gave way under my right foot, sending a scattering of pebbles down the cliff. My heart jumped. I tightened my grip on the roots and rocks along the side of the trail, testing each foothold before putting my weight down. I realized that this part of the trail might not have been maintained in years. Rocks had fallen, soil had eroded, and the path was dangerously narrow. I forced myself to stay calm, taking measured steps. I reminded myself to stay rational. Panic would make this worse. Eventually, The ridge flattened slightly, and the trail led into a dense stand of trees. The forest here was darker, the canopy thick, letting in only specks of light. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of decaying leaves was strong. I noticed that the trail became less distinct, covered with fallen branches and leaves. I slowed my pace, checking my map more frequently. The trail markers were faint, just occasional scratches on tree trunks or small piles of rocks. I felt the isolation acutely. There was no sound of other hikers, no distant roads or human activity. Only the wind, the occasional bird, and the distant trickle of water from somewhere below. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small plateau with a shallow pond fed by a trickle from a nearby stream. The water was still and cold, reflecting the gray sky above. I paused to eat some food, unpacking a small sandwich and a few granola bars. My legs ached, and I felt the familiar soreness of hours of climbing. I drank slowly, savoring the cold water and the quiet around me. The plateau felt safe, but I knew the trail ahead was steep again. I checked my compass and map, estimating the remaining distance to my planned campsite. There were still a few more ridges to cross, and the trail would descend sharply afterward. The descent started gradually, then steepened quickly. The trail became a narrow chute of loose gravel and small rocks. I moved slowly, testing each step, leaning slightly backward to maintain balance. The stones shifted underfoot constantly, forcing me to adjust with each step. The slope was relentless, and I realized I had underestimated the difficulty of this section. My thighs burned, and my boots slipped occasionally, making my stomach lurch. I focused on staying calm and methodical, moving deliberately. At one point, I nearly lost my footing entirely when a larger rock gave way. My pack threw me off balance, and I had to grab a nearby root to steady myself. My hands scraped against the bark, but it was enough to prevent a fall. After what felt like hours, I reached the bottom of the slope, where the trail leveled out near a small creek. The water was cold and clear, and I paused to rest and drink. I took off my boots to wring out the moisture and inspect for blisters. My feet were sore and swollen, and the cool water helped reduce some of the pain. I refilled my water bottle and took a few moments to stretch. The forest here was dense, the underbrush thick, and I had to push branches and ferns aside to keep moving. The daylight was fading, the gray sky darkening, and I realized I had to set up camp soon if I wanted to avoid hiking in the dark. I found a small flat area near the creek, sheltered by a stand of trees. The ground was covered with pine needles and leaves, making it soft but dry enough to pitch a small tent. I set up my shelter carefully, checking that the tent was secure and the stakes were driven firmly into the ground. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches above. I gathered small twigs and branches to make a fire, using dry bark as tinder. Lighting the fire was not easy. The wood was damp, and the wind threatened to blow out the sparks. After several attempts, a small flame caught, and I fed it gradually until it grew into a steady fire. The warmth was a relief, and the crackling flames illuminated the small clearing, casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the forest. The sounds were constant but subtle: the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of water from the creek. I felt exposed and vulnerable, aware that I was alone in a vast wilderness. But I also felt a deep sense of accomplishment, having navigated difficult terrain and survived the day's challenges. I slept fitfully, waking periodically to check the fire and the perimeter of the clearing. The cold seeped through the tent, and I added layers to stay warm. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved to have made it through the first night. The next day, I packed up camp and continued along the trail. The forest gradually thinned as I descended, revealing wider views of the surrounding hills and valleys. I moved carefully, aware that the trail was still uneven and that hidden roots or loose rocks could cause injury. The further I went, the more the terrain opened up, and I began to see distant signs of civilization. A faint trail marker here, a footbridge over a wider stream there. The hike remained challenging, but the danger decreased with each step. I felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. By mid-afternoon, I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about being completely immersed in nature, away from roads, traffic, and the constant hum of everyday life that made me feel alive. It was not about solitude in a lonely sense, but about focus and clarity. My mind could wander freely while my body moved through the landscape. That morning, I set out early, before the sun had fully risen, packing my backpack with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a small camping stove, and a detailed map of the area. I had chosen a remote trail I had never explored before, a narrow path that climbed through dense forest and then opened into a ridge that promised wide views. I was drawn to it because of its isolation. I wanted the kind of hike where the only sounds were the wind through the trees, birdsong, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The first few hours were exactly as I imagined. The forest was thick and lush, the kind of old growth that had survived decades of neglect. The air was cool, damp, and carried a faint smell of earth and moss. Sunlight barely broke through the canopy, creating long, dappled streaks on the forest floor. I moved slowly, deliberately, taking in the details. I noticed how certain ferns grew taller in shaded pockets, how moss seemed to grow in thicker layers on fallen logs that had been rotting for years, how the air felt heavier near the streams that crisscrossed the trail. Occasionally, I would see tracks, small animal prints pressed into the mud, but nothing alarming. It was the kind of forest that felt alive, aware, but not threatening. As the morning progressed, the trail began to climb more steeply. My legs burned and sweat soaked my shirt, but I welcomed the exertion. There was a rhythm to hiking that I loved, the way the body slowly adjusted to the incline, the way the mind settled into a sort of meditative focus. At one point, I stopped on a narrow ledge that jutted slightly out from the hillside. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, a vast green sea that seemed to ripple in the wind. I paused to catch my breath and to drink water. My map indicated that the ridge I wanted to reach was still a few hours away, but I felt confident. I continued upward, the path winding tighter and narrower. Fallen leaves made the ground slick, and I had to pay close attention to each step. The trail was hardly used. Some sections were partially overgrown with brush, roots reaching up like gnarled hands across the path. Around midday, I reached a point where the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing. I took off my pack and sat on a flat rock to eat. The sunlight was warm, and the air had a faint scent of pine. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply sit and observe. I watched a hawk circle above the ridge, its shadow moving across the treetops. After resting, I got up and moved on. The trail became steeper and rockier. Small cliffs and ledges appeared alongside the path, making careful footing essential. It was during this part of the hike that I began to notice something odd. The sound of the forest, which had always been a constant backdrop, started to change. The birds grew quieter, and there was a faint rustling that seemed too deliberate to be a deer or squirrel. I told myself it was just my imagination, that remote trails tend to heighten your senses. Still, I stayed alert, keeping my walking stick ready and my eyes scanning the trees. The ridge itself was not immediately visible. I had expected it to appear gradually, but the forest seemed to close in around me, thick and almost oppressive. The path became less defined, and I had to pause several times to reorient myself with my map. It was easy to feel lost here, even with a clear plan. I double-checked my route, confirming landmarks I had noted on my map, trying to maintain my bearings. By late afternoon, the forest began to thin. The trail opened onto a slope scattered with boulders, twisted trees, and patches of dry grass. I could finally see the ridge I was aiming for. It looked magnificent from this distance, a long stretch of exposed rock running parallel to the valley below. However, as I started moving toward it, I noticed the sky darkening. Heavy clouds were rolling in faster than I had expected, and the wind picked up sharply. I shrugged on my jacket, adjusting my pack, but a feeling of unease began to creep in. This ridge was more exposed than I had anticipated, and the combination of wind, slick rocks, and rising clouds made me think twice about pushing forward too quickly. Still, I wanted to reach the top. The view promised to be worth it, and I had planned this hike for weeks. I climbed carefully, stepping over rocks and tree roots, feeling the wind press against my back and sides. Each step had to be deliberate. The clouds thickened, and a faint drizzle began. Rocks grew slippery underfoot. I paused on a particularly narrow section, looking down at the valley below. It was breathtaking, but there was a sharp edge to it, a reminder that one misstep here could be fatal. I felt a pulse of adrenaline, that mixture of awe and fear that always comes when you're on the edge of something dangerous but beautiful. It was here that things started to feel truly wrong. I heard the sound first, a faint, irregular crunching of leaves and branches behind me. At first, I told myself it was just a small animal, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush, but the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, and always behind me. I paused and listened, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint the source. The forest was otherwise silent, the wind cutting sharply across the ridge, the drizzle now heavier. Then I realized the rhythm was wrong for an animal. It was heavier, more purposeful, and it seemed to mirror my own steps, always just far enough away to remain unseen. I tightened my grip on my walking stick, my heart rate climbing. I considered turning back, but the slope behind me was just as treacherous as the path forward, maybe more so, and the daylight was fading fast. My mind raced through possible scenarios. I had always been cautious, but something about this felt different. I kept moving, careful to step lightly, to stay aware of the edge on one side and the dense underbrush on the other. Every crack of a branch or snap of a twig made me flinch. The sound followed. I stopped again, listening. Nothing, just the wind, the drizzle, and the occasional distant call of a bird. I forced myself to breathe steadily. I had to stay calm. Panic would make a misstep likely, and I couldn't afford that. Slowly, carefully, I continued upward. My boots slipped on the wet rock, but I managed to keep my footing. I glanced back once, too risky to do repeatedly, and the forest looked empty. Still, the sense of being watched remained, gnawing at the edges of my focus. The final stretch to the top of the ridge was steep and exposed. I had to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. Rain made the surface slick, and loose stones threatened to slide underfoot. I inched forward, muscles tense, every movement deliberate. My backpack felt heavier with each step, but I couldn't stop now. The top was just a few meters away, and then it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of wet moss, and I lost balance. My heart jumped into my throat. My hands scrabbled for purchase on the rock surface. The moment stretched, endless and terrifying, but I managed to grab a jagged edge with one hand. My other hand clutched my walking stick and a small tree root that stuck out. I hung there, muscles trembling, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Carefully, agonizingly, I pulled myself back onto solid footing. I sank to the rock surface, panting, my hands raw and scraped from gripping stone. Shaken, I took a few moments to recover. The rain had picked up, the wind was harsher, but I was alive. And finally, I reached the top. The ridge opened fully before me, stretching into the distance with panoramic views of the valley below and the mountains beyond. The sense of relief and triumph washed over me. I knew the hike had pushed me to the limits of focus and endurance, but I had made it safely. I spent some time at the top, carefully surveying the area and taking photos with my phone. The storm had passed over, leaving the forest below glistening with moisture, every leaf sparkling in the filtered sunlight. I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was the reason I hiked, for moments like this, for challenges met and overcome. Eventually, I turned to begin my descent. I moved more cautiously than before, aware of slippery surfaces and loose rocks. The return path was treacherous in its own way, but experience had sharpened my instincts. I traced my steps carefully, always aware of footing, handholds, and the contours of the terrain. By the time I reached the lower slopes and the forest floor, my legs were exhausted, my body soaked, but my spirit was intact. I emerged from the trail hours later as dusk fell, the forest now quiet except for the gentle hum of insects and the distant call of a lone bird. My car was exactly where I had left it. I sat for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling the ache in my muscles and the satisfaction in I had always considered myself an experienced hiker. I had spent years exploring mountains, forests, and trails, often alone, sometimes with friends, but mostly alone. There was a certain satisfaction in pushing myself physically, in feeling the ache in my muscles, the sting of sweat in my eyes, and the pounding of my heart as I climbed higher and higher. That sense of being completely immersed in the natural world, disconnected from the daily grind, was addictive. It was the one place where I felt entirely myself, away from work, from responsibilities, from the constant noise of life. I didn't expect that one hike would challenge me more than any other, or that it would leave me with a memory so vivid that I would relive it over and over, unable to shake the fear that had crept in silently but relentlessly. It was mid-September when I planned the hike. I had chosen a section of wilderness that was notoriously remote. The trailhead was miles from the nearest road, and the map indicated that the area had little traffic, almost no human presence for stretches of 10 to 20 miles at a time. It was perfect. I wanted solitude, a challenge, and something untouched. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had plenty of food, water, extra clothing, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, and a detailed map of the area. I even brought a GPS device, though I didn't want to rely too heavily on it. I liked the skill of navigating with a map and compass. I started early in the morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a thin, cold light over the forest. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of damp leaves and pine. The first few miles were easy enough. The trail was clear, marked with occasional signs nailed to trees, and I moved at a steady pace. The sound of my boots crunching over fallen leaves and twigs was the only noise in the forest. Occasionally, I saw deer tracks or the scat of small animals, but there was nothing alarming. I had passed through forests like this countless times before, and the solitude felt invigorating rather than intimidating. After about 5 hours, I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked clearly on my map. One path went left, descending slightly into a denser part of the forest, and the other went right, ascending more steeply but appearing to continue along the ridge. I hesitated briefly, checking my map and the compass, and decided to take the right path. The ascent was steeper than I had anticipated, and soon I was sweating despite the cool air. I welcomed the exertion. It made the journey feel purposeful, but after a while, the trail became less distinct. There were faint marks of old trail maintenance, perhaps cut logs or small cairns, but they were sparse. By early afternoon, I realized I had been hiking for nearly 6 hours without seeing any other human presence. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, drank some water, and ate a granola bar. I checked my map and GPS. The GPS signal was patchy, inconsistent, and sometimes disappeared entirely, leaving only an approximate location. The map suggested that I was nearing a small creek that I could follow downstream to reach a campsite marked on older maps. I decided to continue in that direction. The forest became darker as I moved deeper. The trees were taller, older, and densely packed. The trail was almost non-existent now, more a faint suggestion of a path than an actual route. I stepped carefully over fallen branches and around thick undergrowth. My boots sank slightly into moss and wet soil, and I had to push aside low-hanging branches that scratched my face and arms. There was a strange, almost oppressive silence in the forest. No birds sang, no wind rustled the leaves, no insects buzzed near me. Only the sound of my own movement and my breathing filled the air. I should have felt peaceful, as I often did in the forest, but instead, a creeping unease settled over me. I brushed it off at first. After all, it was normal to feel slightly anxious when you are alone in an unfamiliar wilderness. But as I moved further, the path became harder to follow, the terrain rougher, and the canopy above thick enough to dim the sunlight significantly. I had to climb over fallen trees, navigate around boulders, and occasionally descend steep, slippery slopes. Each time I stopped to rest, I felt exposed, as though the forest itself was watching, silent but aware of my presence. Around mid-afternoon, I heard a sound that made my heart skip, a low, distant snapping of branches, not in rhythm with my own movements. I froze. The sound stopped almost immediately, but it was enough to put me on edge. I reminded myself that it could have been an animal, a deer, a fox, or even a branch falling in the wind. But the forest was eerily still. No wind blew, and there were no signs of larger wildlife. I kept moving, faster now, alert to every noise. The next 2 hours were a blur of careful steps and constant vigilance. The trail was almost entirely gone now, forcing me to navigate by the map and compass alone, using landmarks that were often obscured by the thick forest. I crossed the remains of a small landslide, walked along steep ridges with sheer drops to one side, and clambered over boulders covered in moss so slick that I had to grip tree roots to keep from falling. My muscles burned, my water supply was dwindling, and the sun was beginning its descent behind the dense canopy. At some point, I realized I had lost track of time. My GPS was unreliable, the sun was low, and I could not find the creek marked on my map. Panic began to creep in. Not full-blown terror, but a gnawing worry that I might be lost in a remote area with darkness approaching. I tried to retrace my steps, but the dense forest and rough terrain made every movement exhausting. Every log, boulder, and root looked familiar and yet slightly different, making it impossible to determine whether I was backtracking correctly. I decided to stop and think. I found a small clearing, barely enough space to sit, and tried to assess my situation. My water supply was down to half a liter, my food was minimal, and the forest was thick and darkening rapidly. I knew I couldn't continue wandering indefinitely without risking dehydration or injury. I needed a plan. I thought about the possibility of descending to a lower elevation, hoping to find a larger water source or trail. I also considered staying put, conserving energy and waiting for someone to find me. Neither option felt ideal, but staying in one place seemed slightly safer. I found a small depression in the ground where I could sit and brace myself against a tree. I tried to focus on my breathing, slowing it, controlling the panic that threatened to rise. I looked around, scanning for landmarks, listening for any sounds of water or distant wildlife. Hours passed in near silence. The sky outside the trees was fading to deep blue, then black. I realized I had no light except my small flashlight, and I hated the idea of moving in complete darkness through unknown terrain. Night fully descended, and the forest became nearly impenetrable to the senses. My flashlight revealed little beyond a few feet, the beam reflecting off wet leaves and moss. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, and I felt as though the darkness was pressing in on me. Sleep was impossible. Any lapse in attention could lead to a fall, a twisted ankle, or worse. I rationed my remaining water and tried to rest my legs in short intervals. Around midnight, I heard movement, something different from before. It was closer, deliberate. The sound of footfalls on leaves and broken twigs echoed softly but unmistakably. My first thought was another hiker, but the trail was rarely used. My mind raced through possibilities. Lost hikers like me, hunters, or perhaps an animal larger than deer. Fear gripped me fully now, a physical weight pressing against my chest. I checked my flashlight. It had barely enough battery for another hour. My options were shrinking. I waited, barely breathing, as the sound approached. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence. My heart hammered. I knew I couldn't stay put forever. I had to move. I decided to descend carefully, sticking to the gentlest slope I could find, hoping it would lead me toward the creek or a recognizable landmark. Step by step, inch by inch, I moved, feeling the forest close in around me. My flashlight illuminated nothing but trees, moss, and darkness. Hours passed like this. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear. My muscles trembled, my eyelids were heavy, and my mind began to feel foggy. I stumbled several times but caught myself. The forest seemed endless, a maze of green and black. Then, just when I thought I could not continue, I noticed a faint glimmer of reflected light, moonlight catching off a patch of water. My pulse quickened. I moved toward it cautiously, hoping it was the creek I had been searching for. It was a small creek, barely more than a stream, but flowing steadily. Relief washed over me. Water meant navigation, a sense of direction, and a chance to survive the night. I followed the creek downstream, keeping as close to the bank as I could. The terrain I had been planning this hike for months. The area I chose was remote, with long trails that twisted through thick forest and rugged mountains. I had a small backpack with essentials: water, granola bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. My boots were new, stiff but supportive, and my jacket was thick enough for the unpredictable mountain weather. The air that morning was crisp, with a smell of wet earth and pine. I parked my car at the trailhead, noticing how empty the lot was. It was early, just past sunrise, and already I felt a mixture of excitement and tension. I liked the solitude, the feeling of being alone in the wilderness, but there was always a thin thread of unease in these isolated places, and today I knew that thread would only grow tighter. The trail started easily, a wide dirt path with gentle slopes. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in warm, golden patches. I walked at a steady pace, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and dry twigs. The further I went, the narrower and rougher the trail became. Roots twisted across the path, stones jutted out, and I had to pay careful attention to avoid tripping. I passed a small creek, the water clear and cold, rushing over rocks. I paused, kneeling to drink directly from it. The sound of the water was soothing, masking the faint rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I shook my head to dismiss it. Animals were common in this area. Deer, raccoons, perhaps a fox. Nothing unusual. I convinced myself of that, though my heart beat a little faster than it should have. By mid-morning, the trail had become a steep incline. The forest thickened, and the air grew cooler as I climbed. Sweat soaked my shirt despite the chill, and my legs ached from the constant effort. I stopped often, not just for rest, but to check my map and make sure I was following the trail correctly. The trail markers were old and faded, and in some places I had to look closely to find the right path. There was no one around, no distant voices, no other hikers, nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It was beautiful, but it was also isolating. Around noon, I reached a ridge that gave a clear view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking, a patchwork of green forests and winding rivers. I took a few photos and drank some water. But as I stood there, I noticed something odd, a faint path diverging from the main trail. It wasn't marked on my map, and it looked less traveled, overgrown and narrow. I considered ignoring it, but a part of me was curious. My plan had been to reach the top of a particular peak before sunset, but I thought perhaps this path might offer a shortcut or a unique view. I glanced back down the main trail. It looked safe and familiar, but the diverging path whispered uncertainty. Against my better judgment, I decided to take it. The moment I stepped onto that path, the feeling of isolation intensified. The forest closed in around me. Trees leaned over the narrow trail, and the underbrush was thick and thorny, scratching at my legs. Every step required careful attention. The path dipped into a small ravine, where moss covered every rock and root. Water trickled here too, barely enough to make a faint stream, but enough to make the ground slick. I slipped once, my hands scraping against rough bark, leaving a thin cut. I ignored it, pressing onward, my heart rate quickening, not from exertion, but from the growing sense of unease. Hours passed, or maybe it was less, or maybe more. Couldn't tell. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, the light dimming quickly. I realized I had lost sight of any familiar markers. The trail was barely a trail now, more like a suggestion, twisted with roots, rocks, and fallen branches. I tried retracing my steps in my mind, but the path had no recognizable landmarks. My map was useless here. This was not the trail I had intended to take. Panic began to bubble under the surface. I slowed my pace, trying to stay calm, listening for any sound that might indicate human presence. Nothing. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of an animal, and the deepening shadows around me. I tried to backtrack, but the path seemed to have changed. Roots and rocks made me slip and stumble. The sun fell lower, and shadows grew long and oppressive. I realized I had no choice but to keep moving forward. The slope steepened, and the terrain became more treacherous. I had to grab onto tree trunks and rocks to keep from sliding down muddy inclines. My backpack felt heavier now, sweat and fatigue weighing on my body. I reached a small plateau and my heart sank. I could see the trail I had come from, but it was shrouded in shadow and looked completely different. In the fading light, everything looked alien, and I couldn't tell where I had been or how to get back. Night fell faster than I expected. I stopped to check my supplies. My water was running low, and I had eaten most of my snacks. I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness but only made the forest beyond it seem deeper, more endless. I kept moving, though every step was careful, deliberate. My mind kept circling around the same thought. I had to find a way out. I couldn't stay here. I had planned for emergencies, but I had assumed that losing the trail wouldn't happen. And now here I was, deep in an unfamiliar forest, with darkness swallowing everything around me. As I moved cautiously, I began to hear sounds I hadn't noticed before. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, low thumps in the distance. My imagination immediately leapt to dangerous wildlife. I knew bears could inhabit these forests, and mountain lions were not impossible. But the sounds didn't have the rhythm of an animal moving naturally. They were irregular, deliberate in a way that made my stomach tighten. My steps became louder as I nervously adjusted my pace, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Every shadow seemed to shift as I moved. Every tree branch looked like it could conceal something watching me. I fought to remain rational, telling myself the sounds were probably small animals, perhaps deer moving through the underbrush, but the tension in my body made it impossible to relax. I stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard onto my knees. Pain shot through my leg, and I realized I had twisted my ankle slightly. Panic flared. If I couldn't walk, I couldn't navigate the terrain, and night in this remote forest with no trail could easily become life-threatening. I rested for a few moments, wincing at the sharp pain in my ankle. The forest was silent now, almost too silent. I pressed forward slowly, leaning on a sturdy branch, trying to keep my weight off my ankle. Every step was agonizing, but I couldn't stop. I had to find a safe place or a recognizable trail before I became completely stranded. Eventually, I reached a ridge. From there, I could see faint pinpricks of light in the distance. My heart leapt. It looked like a small settlement, maybe cabins or a park ranger station. Hope surged through me. I started moving toward it, carefully navigating the uneven terrain. Every step was cautious, my flashlight sweeping the ground in front of me. The pinpricks of light grew slightly brighter as I approached, but the terrain between me and them was treacherous. Steep drops, loose rocks, and thick brush. I had to climb carefully, using tree roots for support, sliding occasionally, but steadily moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged onto a wider path. My ankle screamed in protest, but I ignored it, pushing myself forward. The lights were closer now. Relief washed over me as I realized I had found a service road that led to a ranger station. I kept moving, limping, my backpack catching on branches and my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Eventually, I saw a small building with a dim porch light. Exhausted, I approached and banged on the door. After a few moments, a ranger opened it. Relief and fatigue collided inside me. I explained my situation with gestures, unable to speak properly from exhaustion, but the ranger understood. He offered water, a first aid kit, and a place to sit. I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling from fatigue and adrenaline. The ranger called for assistance and ensured I would be safely guided back to my car in the morning. The night outside was dark and quiet, but inside, I felt the first real sense of safety I had since I lost the trail. My ankle was wrapped, my stomach full of water and small food, and I could finally breathe without fear of being alone in the endless forest. As I sat there, I replayed the day in my mind. The initial excitement, the wrong turn, the growing darkness, the strange sounds, and the fear that had driven every step. The forest had been indifferent to my presence, harsh but not malevolent. It had been my own decisions, curiosity, and underestimation of the terrain that had brought me to the edge of danger. By morning, I was guided back to my car. The sun was rising, the forest calm, beautiful. I had been planning this hike for months, ever since I first discovered a small trail tucked away in a mountainous area that hardly anyone seemed to know about. It was far from any popular park or campground, hidden between steep ridges and dense forests, and the thought of exploring it alone was both thrilling and terrifying. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough water, a heavy-duty first aid kit, a headlamp, my map, compass, extra batteries, protein bars, and a sturdy backpack. I wore a worn pair of hiking boots that had carried me through countless trails before, and a simple jacket layered over a t-shirt. The morning I left, the sky was clear, the air crisp, and I could feel the quiet hum of anticipation in my chest. The trail started gently, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. I stepped carefully, mindful of roots and uneven ground. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled my senses, mixing with the faint aroma of distant wildflowers. Small animals scurried away as I passed, and the occasional bird call punctuated the silence. At first, everything felt normal, almost serene, the way any well-maintained trail might feel before the real challenge began. After 2 hours of steady walking, the trail became steeper. Rocks jutted out from the earth, and my boots slipped on loose gravel. I gripped trees and used my trekking poles to steady myself. The incline made my lungs burn, and my legs trembled with the strain, but the thought of reaching the ridge kept me going. I paused at a large boulder to catch my breath, drinking water and scanning the horizon. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in dense forest stretched out endlessly, the sun glinting off patches of exposed rock. I felt small, but alive, completely absorbed by the wildness surrounding me. I continued, moving into a narrow section of the trail where the trees crowded together so tightly that sunlight barely touched the ground. The air grew cooler, damp with morning dew clinging to moss-covered trunks. Here, the forest felt different. The silence was heavier, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. My boots crunched on twigs and leaves, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. I told myself this was normal, that every forest has its quiet moments, but a tiny part of my mind warned me to pay attention, to notice everything. Several hours into the hike, the trail opened slightly to reveal a shallow creek cutting through the forest. Water ran over smooth rocks, clear and cold. I knelt to drink some from my bottle, careful not to disturb the balance of stones. While resting, I realized I had been hiking longer than I anticipated without seeing any signs of other people. No footprints, no litter, no faint sound of human activity. Just the forest, entirely untouched. It was exciting, but also unnerving. I pressed on. The trail began to climb more sharply, the incline relentless. Loose rocks made each step precarious. My legs were screaming, and my backpack pressed heavily against my shoulders. I knew I was approaching the ridge I had seen on the map, and that kept me going, step by painstaking step. By early afternoon, I reached a point where the trail split into 2 narrow paths, neither marked. I checked my map and compass carefully. Both paths seemed plausible. One followed the contour of the ridge, the other descended slightly before climbing again. I hesitated, trying to choose the safer option. I picked the path that hugged the ridge, reasoning that staying higher would give me a better view and avoid unnecessary descents. Almost immediately, the trail became treacherous. Rocks shifted under my weight, and the slope on one side dropped sharply into a dense forest below. I had to focus completely on each step, testing stones before putting my weight on them. Every now and then, I slipped slightly, my hands scraping against rough bark or jagged rock. The wind picked up along the ridge, cold and biting. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving, though unease was creeping in. Something about the isolation, the combination of altitude and silence, set my nerves on edge. Hours passed. My legs were exhausted, my hands raw from gripping rocks and branches. I had been on the ridge for what felt like an eternity, and the path was beginning to narrow dangerously. At one point, the trail became almost vertical, forcing me to climb using both hands and feet. Loose gravel made it hard to find secure footing. I stopped to rest on a small ledge, looking down at the drop. The forest below seemed endless and impossible to navigate if I fell. My pulse was fast, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, testing each stone before moving. As the day wore on, clouds began to gather. The sky turned gray, and I could feel the first hints of a storm approaching. The wind howled along the ridge, stronger now, threatening to knock me off balance. I realized I was in a dangerous situation. I could continue along the ridge, risking the worst of the storm, or try to descend to the forest floor, hoping to find safer ground. My decision was complicated by fatigue and the fading light. I decided to descend, keeping as close to the ridge as possible while moving carefully down the slope. The descent was brutal. Loose rocks tumbled beneath my feet, forcing me to stop constantly to avoid sliding. My legs shook with exhaustion, and my hands were cut and scraped from clinging to sharp bark. The forest below was dense, making it hard to see where I could safely step. The storm approached faster than I expected, and rain began to drizzle lightly before turning into a steady downpour. Rocks became slick, mud formed beneath my boots, and the trees around me groaned under the wind. I was soaked, shivering, and every step demanded complete concentration. As darkness fell, visibility became almost zero. My headlamp illuminated only a small circle of rain-soaked forest, and every shadow seemed like a threat. I tried to follow a faint animal trail I spotted, hoping it would lead me to a safer area. My boots sank into mud, and I slipped several times, each slip a heart-stopping moment where I feared a fall could end everything. I felt completely alone, the storm and the forest a relentless combination pressing in on all sides. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing with a few rocks I could sit on. My clothes were soaked, my hands bleeding, and my legs trembling. I tried to catch my breath, knowing I needed to decide my next move. Staying in the clearing seemed unsafe, but moving in darkness could be fatal. I decided to wait until the storm slowed, then continue cautiously. Hours passed. The storm weakened slightly, leaving a steady drizzle and strong wind. I forced myself to move again, slowly picking my way through the mud and roots. Every step was measured, testing rocks and branches before trusting them. My hands were numb, my fingers stiff, and my backpack felt impossibly heavy. I was acutely aware of how far I was from civilization, how easily a misstep could end me. Finally, after hours of slow, painstaking movement, I noticed a faint line of lights in the distance. My heart leapt. I realized it was a small ranger station or cabin I had seen marked on my map. I followed the lights, moving as quickly as I could without risking another fall. Each step felt like a victory, each inch a reassurance. By the time I reached the cabin, my body was completely drained. Mud covered me from boots to jacket. My hands were cut and swollen, and I was shivering uncontrollably. Inside the cabin, I found basic supplies: dry wood, blankets, and a radio. I stripped off my wet clothes, wrapped myself in a blanket, and felt the first sense of safety I had experienced in hours. Using the radio, I contacted the ranger, explained my location, and requested assistance. While waiting, I huddled near the fire I managed to start, every sound outside keeping me alert, but also bringing a strange comfort. I realized how lucky I was, how small mistakes, bad timing, or poor decisions could have turned my adventure into a tragedy. By early morning, the ranger arrived. I was weak, exhausted, and muddy, but safe. I was escorted down the mountain carefully with constant support. As the sun rose, illuminating the forest with a golden glow, I realized how fragile life could be in the wilderness. Every step, every decision mattered. I had set out seeking adventure, but I returned with a deeper understanding of respect for nature and its dangers. Back at the ranger station, I cleaned up, ate, and reflected on the ordeal. My body ached, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I realized that surviving was not about skill alone, but about patience, observation, and making careful decisions under pressure. That hike had terrified me, but it had also taught me resilience. I left the mountains with a renewed respect for the wilderness, a story of survival etched into my memory, and a deep awareness that even the most familiar trails could become perilous if caution was abandoned. I remember the morning vividly, even now, years later. It began like any other hiking trip I had taken alone, with a careful plan, a map folded in my pocket, a full water bottle, some granola bars, and a backpack that I had tested and retested at home to make sure it was comfortable. The trailhead was small and barely marked, tucked away in a bend of the road I had driven past dozens of times without noticing. The air smelled like wet pine and dirt, a scent I always loved, and the fog was still hanging low over the valley, softening the edges of the trees and making everything look muted, like a photograph someone had smudged with a finger. I had chosen this trail because it promised solitude, something I needed after months of constant noise and responsibility. I wanted nothing more than to be alone with the trail and the rhythm of my own steps. The first few miles were uneventful, the forest alive but predictable. Birds darted through the branches, the underbrush rustled as small animals went about their business, and the occasional sound of a distant stream punctuated the quiet. I walked at a steady pace, feeling my lungs stretch with the cold, damp air. The trail climbed gradually, winding around moss-covered rocks and fallen logs, sometimes narrowing to just enough room for a single person. I kept thinking about the summit, picturing myself there, taking in a view that would make the effort worthwhile, as I had read in trail reports. I was careful not to hurry, careful to keep my energy for the long day ahead. I reached a point where the trail split in two directions. My map was folded awkwardly in my hand, and I could feel the sweat making the paper damp. One path was well-trodden, the soil packed down and showing signs of frequent use. The other was narrow, overgrown, and barely visible under fallen leaves and pine needles. For a moment, I hesitated. I had no desire for risk, yet something in me felt drawn to the less obvious path, curious to see what few people might find. It wasn't a bold impulse. It was more like a quiet whisper of adventure, the kind that makes you step a little off the beaten path and wonder. I chose the overgrown trail, telling myself I'd be careful, that I'd turn back if it seemed unsafe. That decision would later become a decision I would question endlessly. At first, the trail seemed harmless, even beautiful. The trees arched overhead, creating a tunnel of green and gold as sunlight filtered through the branches. The path twisted and turned, occasionally revealing patches of wildflowers and small ferns that leaned over the sides. I noticed the way the forest floor changed, the soil softer here, covered in moss and fallen needles, and the air felt cooler, heavier with the smell of damp wood. I kept walking, feeling a strange thrill in the quiet isolation. No one had passed this way in days, maybe weeks. It was entirely silent except for the crunch of my boots on the path and the distant hum of a bird I could not identify. After a couple of hours, the trail began to deteriorate. What had been soft dirt and moss became a slick slope of clay, damp from an earlier rain. My boots slipped occasionally, forcing me to pause and steady myself. The trees grew denser, branches blocking the sky in irregular patterns. I realized that I hadn't seen another trail marker in a long time. I pulled out my map again, and my stomach sank slightly as I compared it to my surroundings. The lines on the paper promised a straight path to a creek that marked the halfway point, but I could see no evidence of it. I started paying closer attention to the terrain, looking for signs of the path. Broken branches, footprints, disturbed leaves, anything. The further I went, the less confident I felt that this trail had ever been used much at all. By the time I reached a point where the forest thickened almost to the point of being impassable, I began to realize I had no way to know if I was still on a path or if I had wandered off entirely. The underbrush scraped at my legs, and the occasional root tripped me. I noticed that the forest floor seemed unnatural. Patches of soil that looked like they had been disturbed recently, footprints too large and deep to be my own, faintly visible in the damp clay. My pulse quickened. Not in fear of people, I had never seen anyone else on this trail, but the realization that I had wandered into a part of the forest that no hiker likely visited. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating in its density. I paused and breathed, reminding myself that panicking would not help. I turned back slightly, trying to retrace my steps, but the trail had already disappeared under fallen branches and leaves. Hours passed like this. I moved cautiously, avoiding slick patches, occasionally sliding and using my hands to stabilize myself. The forest seemed endless, a maze that twisted in directions that did not make sense. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows between the trees, and I realized that I had no visual reference to the trailhead anymore. The sense of calm adventure I had felt in the morning was gone, replaced by a creeping anxiety. Every shadow seemed a little too deep, every distant sound a little too deliberate. I reminded myself constantly, I had done this before. I had been lost in the woods once or twice and always found my way back. Still, the difference now was subtle but sharp. I was in territory I did not recognize at all, with no clear markers, and the light was fading faster than I expected. At one point, I came across a creek, not the one on the map, but a narrow, muddy stream cutting through the forest. It was shallow but full of tangled roots and slippery stones. I decided to follow it, thinking that water often leads to civilization or a recognizable trail. The sound of moving water was oddly comforting after hours of oppressive silence, and I imagined that someone might see me if I followed it. But the creek soon became more of a barrier than a guide. It was deeper, faster, and the banks were steep and unstable. My boots slipped in the mud, and I almost fell several times. I had to move slowly, carefully choosing each step, testing the ground before putting my full weight down. The fear was creeping in steadily now, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that sharpens your senses and makes you aware of every sound, every movement, every risk. As the day turned toward evening, I realized that I was underprepared. My water was low, I had only eaten a small granola bar, and the temperature was dropping faster than I anticipated. The forest was no longer green and muted but dark and oppressive. Shadows had sharpened into angles, the trees casting twisted shapes on the forest floor. The underbrush seemed thicker, as if I was moving deeper into a natural maze. My mind began running scenarios. I could try to backtrack, but I wasn't sure I could recognize the path I had taken. I could follow the creek, but it seemed to be leading me deeper into the woods. Or I could try to push straight through, hoping for a clearing or a recognizable landmark. Every choice seemed like a risk, and every risk felt immediate. I chose to follow the creek, moving slowly, testing my footing, trying to remain calm. It was tiring work, every step requiring careful attention. My legs ached, my back hurt from carrying the pack, and my throat was dry. The creek twisted through the trees, sometimes disappearing under fallen logs, sometimes widening into puddles. I lost count of how many hours I had been moving, but the fading light told me it was late afternoon, approaching evening. The realization that night would come and I had no shelter made my stomach knot with fear. I had brought a small flashlight, but I wanted to save the batteries. I kept telling myself that I could make it, that I had survived harder hikes, that this was just a test of patience and endurance. Then it happened. I heard it first as a faint rustling behind me, then a snapping of a branch closer. My heart jumped. I had been alert to sounds all day, but this felt different, deliberate. I stopped moving, holding my breath, straining to see in the dim light. The forest was thick, the creek winding away. I considered calling out, but it was not a call for help I wanted to make. It would announce my position to whatever was there. My first thought was an animal, something large perhaps, a bear or a mountain lion. I froze, remembering the advice I had read. Make yourself look bigger, stay calm, do not run. But no sound followed the initial snap, only silence after the rustling. My pulse pounded in my ears. I considered climbing a tree, but the banks of the creek were muddy and slippery, the trees low and twisted. Minutes passed, each one stretching painfully long. Then I saw it. A shape moving along the creek bank, careful, deliberate. It was human. The sight was shocking, my brain immediately firing warning signals. I had no idea who it could be, whether they were lost like me or whether they had intentions I could not know. The rational part of my mind reminded me, there are hikers out here sometimes, people who get lost or explore off-trail. But the irrational part screamed, move, hide, get away. I backed slowly along the creek, trying to put some distance between us, my eyes never leaving the shape. It mirrored me, keeping a distance, and I realized that it was following me. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. Run. I had planned this hike for months, studying maps, checking weather reports, and packing every item I could think of. It was a solo trek through a remote mountainous area, far from any roads or towns, where the trails were little more than faint paths carved into the earth by hikers over decades. I wanted isolation, a chance to disconnect completely from the constant noise of the city, and I believed I could handle it. I told myself I was prepared for anything. I wasn't entirely wrong, but I wasn't ready for everything either. I began the hike early in the morning, just as the sun was rising over the peaks. The air was crisp and cold, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth. I carried a full pack with a tent, sleeping bag, water, food, and all the necessary gear. My boots crunched on the frost-hardened ground as I walked steadily, feeling a mix of excitement and calm. The first few hours were uneventful. Birds called from the trees, a light mist clung to the low areas, and I moved quickly, confident in my pace. The trail followed a small creek at first, winding through thick forest, and the sound of running water was soothing. I stopped periodically to refill my bottle, take photos, and jot notes in my journal. Everything felt perfect. By mid-morning, the trail started to climb. The trees thinned, revealing rocky slopes and steep drops. I slowed my pace, careful with each step, focusing on the best route over loose stones. The sun was high now, and I could see distant peaks covered in snow. The air was thinner here, colder, and drier, and my chest burned slightly with each breath. I reminded myself to pace myself, to drink water, and to rest when needed. I found a small flat rock and took a short break, eating a granola bar while taking in the view. I felt a rush of satisfaction at being this high, this far from civilization, alone with nothing but nature. After about 3 hours of climbing, the trail became less distinct. Large rocks blocked the way in places, and the undergrowth encroached on the path. I followed faint signs. A broken branch here, a small pile of stones there. I had a compass and a GPS, but I wanted to trust my instincts to feel like a real explorer. The solitude was intoxicating at first. The only sounds were the wind through the rocks and the occasional distant bird. I felt free. But then, I noticed something odd. The trail markers were becoming inconsistent. The stone piles were fewer, and some seemed deliberately misplaced. I hesitated, thinking I might have missed a turn. I retraced my steps for a short distance, looking carefully, but everything seemed to be the same. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. Shadows stretched across the ground, making the rocks appear taller and more threatening. I felt a twinge of anxiety but brushed it off. I reminded myself that I had maps, that I knew the general direction I wanted to go. I could find a safe spot to camp if necessary. I continued uphill, now moving slower, more cautiously. The wind had picked up, whistling through the peaks, and I realized I might not make it to the spot I had planned for the night. I spotted a flat ledge near a cluster of boulders that seemed suitable for pitching my tent. As I approached, I noticed the ground was uneven, covered with small stones, and the cliff edge was uncomfortably close. I decided it would have to do. I set up my tent quickly, securing the stakes against the wind, and crawled inside. My heart was still racing from the climb, and I felt a sense of relief as I ate some dinner and took a long drink of water. I had been moving for over 8 hours. I reviewed the map again and marked my approximate position. Tomorrow, I would descend into a valley where the trail was better marked, and I would be back on course. Night fell fast. The wind grew stronger, rattling my tent and sending chills through my body. I had packed a warm sleeping bag, and I layered my clothes to stay comfortable. I tried to sleep, but every gust and every crack of shifting rock kept me alert. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, repetitive sound, like stones tumbling down a slope somewhere above me. At first, I thought it was just loose rocks falling naturally. But then I realized the sound was moving, slowly, deliberately over a ridge. My mind raced. Could it be animals? Mountain goats, perhaps, or a large predator? I had no way of knowing. I checked my flashlight and my small knife just in case. I lay very still, straining to hear over the wind. The sound stopped after a while, and eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke before dawn, shivering, with frost inside the tent. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and eerie. I unzipped the tent and looked around. The ledge I had chosen looked even more precarious in the pale morning light. A closer inspection revealed small animal tracks, probably deer or elk, leading toward the cliff edge. I reminded myself to stay calm and not let fear dictate my decisions. I packed up quickly, eating a small breakfast of nuts and dried fruit, and set out to continue my hike. My goal was to reach a larger trail that would lead me down into the valley. The climb was treacherous. Loose rocks slid under my feet, and the path narrowed to a thin ledge along a steep drop. My legs burned with exertion, and my hands were raw from gripping rocks. I moved carefully, each step deliberate, conscious of the consequences of a misstep. As I rounded a bend, I glimpsed something ahead that made my stomach knot. A small landslide had occurred recently, partially blocking the trail. Rocks the size of soccer balls had tumbled across the path, leaving deep grooves in the soil. I had to find a way around it. I assessed the slope, checking for loose rocks or hidden holes. After several minutes, I found a narrow detour, forcing myself to inch along a steep incline with nothing but air below me on one side. My heart pounded, sweat stinging my eyes, but I made it across. The relief was temporary. I knew the hardest part was still ahead. By mid-morning, I reached a point where the trail vanished entirely. My GPS showed a possible path down a nearby ravine, but it was steep and littered with boulders. I debated whether to backtrack, but that would mean losing valuable time and energy. Carefully, I began my descent, using trees and rocks to steady myself. I slipped once, my hands scraping against a jagged rock, but I caught myself. My legs ached, my pack felt unbearably heavy, and my hands were covered in cuts and scrapes. The ravine narrowed as I went lower, and the sun disappeared behind the cliffs, leaving me in shadow. The silence was oppressive. I could hear my breathing, the faint rustle of leaves, and the occasional distant bird. I reminded myself to focus, to keep moving, and to conserve energy. Hours passed. The terrain became more rugged. At one point, I had to climb down a steep drop of about 8 feet using only the roots of a tree and a protruding rock. My fingers were raw, my arms trembling, but I managed it. As I reached the bottom of the ravine, I realized I had lost the faint trail entirely. The GPS showed I was close to the valley, but the final approach was through thick brush and unstable ground. I began to feel panic creeping in, an unfamiliar sensation that made my hands shake and my mind race. I stopped for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I reminded myself that panic would only make me make mistakes. I needed to be methodical, deliberate, patient. I moved slowly, clearing branches and testing the ground before stepping. The slope was steep, and loose soil threatened to give way with every step. At one point, I nearly fell when a patch of dirt slid beneath my boot. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, holding onto a nearby tree. I realized then how dangerous this hike had become. I had underestimated the mountain, overestimated my abilities, and ignored subtle warning signs. I felt a deep, gnawing fear, not of the unknown, but of the very real possibility that a misstep could cost me dearly. I reminded myself to keep moving, to focus on the ground directly in front of me, to ignore everything else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a more stable area, a flat stretch with fewer loose rocks and thicker vegetation. I was exhausted, bruised, and battered, but I could finally see the valley below. A faint trail ran through the trees, well-marked and clearly used by other hikers. Relief washed over me in a wave so intense it left me trembling. I descended slowly, savoring each step, careful not to twist an ankle or slip on the uneven terrain. As I moved, I noticed the valley floor opening up, sunlight filtering through the trees, and a distant stream running through a grassy meadow. Birds called, and the air smelled sweet with the scent of wildflowers and damp soil. I could feel my body relaxing, the tension in my muscles easing for the first time in hours. By late afternoon, I emerged fully from the forest onto the main trail. It was clear, wide, and well used. I had been planning this hike for months. The map I carried had been marked with careful precision, highlighting the trails I intended to take and the spots where I would camp. I was going to tackle a long stretch of the Appalachian wilderness that few people dared to explore in a single outing. It was supposed to be a test of endurance, a way to push myself past the normal limits of comfort and safety. I had packed carefully, or so I thought. My backpack held the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothing layers, a flashlight with spare batteries, a sturdy knife, and a compass. I even carried a small tent and a sleeping bag, though I didn't anticipate needing it for the first night. Everything I owned was packed and double-checked, and I felt confident as I started my journey at dawn. The early morning air was crisp and smelled of wet leaves and pine. The path started off gently enough, winding through low hills and shallow valleys where sunlight streamed through the gaps in the trees. I walked steadily, my boots crunching softly on fallen leaves, feeling the thrill of being alone in the wild. The solitude was exhilarating. Birds called occasionally from high branches, and squirrels darted across the trail, disappearing into the brush. I could see deer tracks in the mud and the occasional mushroom growing in clusters along the path. The trail was well marked at first, signs nailed to trees showing distances and directions. I passed small streams and shallow creeks, pausing to drink and fill my water bottle. Everything was perfect in the way only nature can be, untouched and indifferent. By the afternoon, the trail became steeper. I climbed higher, and the forest thickened. Moss covered the trunks of trees, and the undergrowth was dense. My legs ached from the constant uphill climb, and sweat had soaked through my shirt despite the cool air. I stopped frequently, not just to catch my breath, but to study the terrain. Here, the forest was quieter. The sound of birds had diminished, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves that might have been a small animal moving unseen. Shadows fell in strange patterns on the ground as the sun lowered, making familiar shapes look alien. I felt a twinge of anxiety. This was supposed to be a remote area, but I had expected more hikers, maybe even someone camping along the trail. Instead, I was completely alone. There were no other footprints, no remnants of campsites, nothing. Just me and the dense forest. I reached a small plateau just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I paused to set down my pack, my legs shaking from exertion and fatigue. From this vantage point, I could see a valley below, blanketed in mist that clung to the trees like a gray, moving carpet. The sight was breathtaking, but it also brought an uneasy feeling. I realized how isolated I truly was. There was no road visible, no sign of civilization in any direction, and I could see that continuing the trail meant descending into a thicker, darker forest that swallowed light almost immediately. Still, I had planned to hike further, and I pressed on. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back. The forest grew darker quickly as I descended. The trees were tall and close together, and their branches intertwined, forming a canopy that blocked almost all of the remaining sunlight. The trail became harder to follow. Fallen leaves and branches covered it in many areas, and I had to use my knife to cut away some of the smaller brush to make a path. I felt my heartbeat increase, not just from exertion, but from a growing sense of unease. The silence was heavy. No wind, no birds, no rustling animals. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming fatigue and the late hour, but deep down, I knew that something about this place was not right. I paused, listening carefully. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I froze, straining my ears. Nothing followed, just the distant echo of the snap reverberating through the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or a squirrel, but my body had already stiffened with tension. I decided to keep moving. The trail was steep in parts, and the soil was loose, making each step uncertain. Rocks and tree roots jutted out in unexpected ways, threatening to trip me. I had to move slowly, deliberately, my eyes scanning every inch of the ground. My flashlight was still in my pack. I didn't want to use it unless absolutely necessary. Using it too early would ruin my night vision, and I had enough experience to know that. But as the sun disappeared entirely and darkness fell, I had no choice. I pulled the flashlight from my pack, clicking it on. The beam cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and moss-covered rocks. Every shadow seemed exaggerated, every branch a potential threat. My stomach churned with tension, but I kept moving. I had trained for endurance, and I knew that stopping now would only make things worse. I heard it then, a low, wet growl, distant at first, almost like a trick of the wind. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. The sound came again, clearer this time. A deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear? Wolf? Maybe even a wild dog. My training kicked in. I stopped moving completely, scanning the darkness with the flashlight. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes, distant but focused on me. I felt the adrenaline surge through me, my heart pounding violently. I knew I couldn't outrun a bear on a downhill slope like this. I also knew that running could trigger a chase response. I stayed as still as I could, trying to appear non-threatening. The growl came again, this time closer. I could see the outline of the animal, a large bear, its massive form hunched and tense. My mind screamed at me to stay calm. Slowly, I reached for the canister of bear spray in my belt, keeping my movements minimal. The bear moved a little closer, sniffing the air. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear turned and disappeared into the undergrowth. My body didn't relax until it was out of sight, and even then, my heart continued racing. I knew I had narrowly avoided a deadly encounter. By the time I found a flat clearing suitable for a quick campsite, it was late. I hurriedly set up my tent, shaking slightly from both adrenaline and exhaustion. I ate a small portion of food, just enough to maintain energy, and sipped water sparingly. I knew I wouldn't sleep well, but the tent provided some security, some barrier between me and the dark forest. I lay inside, flashlight beside me, knife within reach, and listened to the forest around me. Every sound was magnified, the wind rustling leaves, the distant crack of a branch, the occasional snap of twigs. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of falling and encounters with the bear. I woke early the next morning, stiff and sore but determined to continue. My body was fatigued, but I had to push on. I packed quickly, checking my supplies. Food was running low, and water needed to be rationed more carefully. The trail today promised to be even more challenging. It descended steeply into a ravine before climbing another ridge. I began walking cautiously, mindful of every step. Loose stones, slick leaves, and exposed roots made the hike treacherous. At one point, I slipped on wet moss, scraping my knee and twisting my ankle slightly. I gritted my teeth against the pain and continued, knowing that giving up was not an option. The forest was dense here, and the light of the rising sun barely penetrated the canopy. I used my flashlight again in shaded areas to prevent further accidents. The sound of running water guided me, and I hoped it would lead to a stream or river I could refill from later. Hours passed. The forest remained quiet, oppressive. My mind became fatigued, not just physically but mentally. The isolation, combined with the previous night's encounter, weighed heavily. I started to question my judgment. wondering if I had underestimated the terrain, the risks, the unpredictability of wild animals. I also realized that my sense of time was distorted. Morning, noon, and afternoon seemed to blend together under the dense canopy. I had to rely solely on my compass and map to navigate. The trail markers were sparse and weathered, some almost entirely hidden by growth. I marked my path carefully with small piles of stones to ensure I could find my way back if needed. As I approached a particularly steep section, the ground became unstable. Loose gravel and dirt threatened to give way with every step. I moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing my weight. The slope was flanked by thick brush and small trees, some of which had fallen over, creating natural obstacles. My muscles screamed with the effort, but I pressed on. Suddenly, a loud rumble echoed through the valley. My stomach dropped. I looked around but saw nothing immediately. Then, a section of the slope above me gave way. Rocks and dirt I had always considered myself someone who could handle the outdoors. I liked the solitude, the sense of being entirely self-reliant in a place where the modern world had little meaning. The feeling of being surrounded by trees, streams, and trails that led into unknown spaces gave me a calm I rarely felt anywhere else. That particular summer, I decided to push myself further than usual, to take a trail I had been hearing about for years but had never attempted. It was known as the Ridgeback Loop, a strenuous trail that followed a series of ridges through thick forest and eventually descended into a narrow valley. The loop was about 45 kilometers long if you did it properly, and it was said to be one of the more isolated trails in the region. I had my backpack, carefully packed with food, water, first aid supplies, a flashlight, extra clothing, and a small but sharp hatchet. I felt prepared, though looking back, there were warnings I ignored that seemed minor at the time. The morning I started, the air was damp with dew, and a light mist hovered over the ground. I remember the smell of wet leaves, dirt, and pine, strong and fresh. I started early, before the sun was fully up, hoping to make the most of the cool morning. The trailhead was quiet. The parking lot had only a few cars, and I didn't see any other hikers. The signboard at the entrance listed the loop and its difficulty, but I only glanced at it quickly. The path was narrow, marked by worn wooden posts, and it immediately began climbing. I felt strong in those first hours, my legs moving steadily, my lungs filling with crisp air. Birds called sporadically from the treetops, and a soft wind rustled the leaves. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, and everything seemed peaceful. The trail climbed steadily for several hours. At first, it was just a slow incline through dense forest, the ground soft with fallen needles and leaves. Small streams crossed the trail occasionally, and I stopped to refill my water bottle from one. The water was cold and clear, and drinking it felt like a relief. Around midday, I reached the first ridge. The sun had climbed higher, cutting through the trees in long beams. From the top, I could see rolling hills in the distance and a river winding far below. I stopped to eat a simple lunch, a sandwich, some nuts, and a bit of chocolate. I felt good, strong, and satisfied. I didn't think much about the isolation. There was a faint sense that no one else was around, but I assumed that at some point on the loop I would encounter other hikers. By mid-afternoon, the trail became more challenging. It narrowed to a single track between thick undergrowth and sharp drops on either side. Some sections were slick with mud from the recent rain, and I had to grip tree roots to keep from sliding. I was careful, moving deliberately, aware that a misstep could cause a serious fall. At one point, I found a small grove where sunlight filtered down in shafts through the branches, dust motes dancing in the beams. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and I had a fleeting thought that maybe this trail was more isolated than I had realized. The sounds of birds were sparse now, and the wind had picked up, rustling the trees in a way that made the forest feel more alive than before. I pushed on, telling myself that this was normal, that it was just nature. I was still confident, still moving well. Late in the afternoon, the trail descended toward the valley. The incline became steeper, and the mud more treacherous. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree trunk, and the impact scraped my right forearm. I winced, examining the cut, but it was superficial, just a shallow line in the skin. I cleaned it with water and bandaged it loosely. Still, I began to feel the strain. My legs were tired, my feet sore. I started thinking about finding a place to camp for the night. There was a flat area near a small creek marked on my map about 5 kilometers ahead. I aimed to reach it before the sun fully set. The forest thickened as I descended. The trees were older here, their trunks massive and gnarled, roots pushing through the soil and rocks. The trail was harder to follow, and in several spots, I had to double back to find the right path. At one point, I realized I had missed a small marker, and I ended up on a narrow spur that dropped toward a cliff. I froze for a moment, heart pounding, then backed carefully up the trail. The realization that I could get lost started to creep into my mind, but I pushed it away. I had a map, I had a compass, and I could find my way. Still, there was a tension now that hadn't been there in the morning. By the time I reached the creek, the sun was low, the sky turning orange and red between the trees. I found a small, flat patch of earth where I could set up my tent. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. I cleared debris, laid down the footprint, and erected the tent. I set up my sleeping bag and placed my backpack inside. I gathered wood for a small fire, careful to keep it contained. As I worked, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, no sound of distant water except the creek nearby. The forest had grown still, and it felt like the weight of isolation pressing in. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was fine. I made dinner, a small packet of dehydrated food, and ate while the last light faded. I lingered by the fire, staring at the darkening trees, listening. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense, but I reminded myself it was probably a deer or a small animal, nothing more. I went to sleep with the sound of the creek, hoping for a normal night. The night was restless. I woke several times to the sound of movement outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just small animals, but then I noticed heavier sounds, the crunch of something larger walking through fallen leaves. My heart raced, and I stayed still, straining to hear. It didn't seem to be heading directly toward me, but it stayed in the vicinity. I tried to reason with myself. Bears were possible, mountain lions less likely, but either way, there was little I could do except stay inside and hope it passed. I didn't have a firearm, only a small knife and the hatchet. I stayed quiet, holding my breath, until the sounds faded into the distance. Morning came slowly, gray and muted. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving and away from that spot. The next day, the trail rose again, climbing out of the valley toward the next ridge. My legs were stiff from the previous day's exertion, and I moved slower, carefully testing each foothold. The forest seemed different in the morning light, but the tension of the night lingered. Around midday, I reached a section that was almost a cliffside. The trail was narrow, just enough for a single person, and a fall would likely be fatal. I kept my weight low, hands on the soil and roots, moving with extreme caution. At one point, a small rock gave way under my foot, sliding down the slope. I froze, realizing how close I had been to losing balance. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic that was beginning to settle in. I could feel fatigue in every muscle, a sharp awareness that my body was reaching its limits. I stopped to rest on a flat boulder protruding from the ridge. From here, I could see far below, the valley winding with the creek, and the far ridge looming above. I pulled out my map and tried to plot the rest of the route. I realized I was behind schedule. The loop had taken longer than expected because of the tricky terrain. I considered setting up a second night here, but there was no good flat space nearby. My best option was to keep moving, even if it meant pushing my body. I drank water, ate a small snack, and started onward. As the afternoon progressed, the trail became even more treacherous. There were fallen trees across the path, slick moss-covered rocks, and areas where the soil had eroded. I moved carefully, testing every step. At one point, I had to use my hatchet to cut a small branch blocking the trail. While doing so, I noticed deep scratches on the trees around me. At first, I thought it was normal animal markings, but the pattern and height made me pause. They were vertical, claw-like marks on trunks about my height. My stomach tightened. I reminded myself that it was probably bears marking territory. Nothing more. Still, it added an edge to the hike I couldn't shake. Late in the day, clouds began rolling in. The sky darkened, and the temperature dropped. I reached a narrow saddle between two ridges, and the wind howled, making it difficult to keep balance. I found a small alcove behind a rock to take a brief rest, but the wind pushed rain sideways, chilling me to the bone. My backpack was heavy, my boots soaked, and I could feel the onset of fatigue in every joint. I had no choice but to continue. The ridge I was trying to reach was still a few kilometers away, and I knew I needed to reach higher ground before nightfall. The rain made the trail muddy and slippery, each step a calculated effort. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows heavy, the sense of isolation sharp. By the time I reached the upper ridge, twilight had set in. The wind had calmed slightly, but my body was exhausted. I found a flat patch of ground and quickly set up my tent. The area was I had always loved hiking, not in a casual sense, but in a way that demanded everything from me. Stamina, focus, preparation, and patience. I liked being in places where there were no paths, no signs, no other people. There was a sense of absolute control in choosing your route, and yet an equal sense of vulnerability because no one could find you if you made a mistake. That vulnerability is what always attracted me the most. On this particular trip, I decided to explore a remote stretch of mountains that I had only read about in old trail journals and scattered online posts. They were a part of a range far from anything familiar, with cliffs that fell into mist-filled ravines and ridges where the wind could easily push an unsteady hiker off balance. I told no one where I was going. It was a solo hike for 4 days over the longest weekend I could spare. I had studied maps, terrain elevations, water sources, and weather forecasts. I had packed as much as I thought reasonable: food, water, a first aid kit, a lightweight sleeping bag, a tent, fire-starting gear, and a basic rope with a small climbing harness. I carried a compass and a map, both of which I trusted far more than any phone or GPS, because I didn't trust service out here. I started the hike early in the morning, the sky pale with dawn, and the trailhead was already empty except for a few cars parked at the edge of the forest. The first mile was smooth, almost deceptively easy, with a gentle slope that allowed me to warm up without strain. I remember the smell of damp pine and earth mixed with the faint scent of decaying leaves. Birds called occasionally, but I noticed their calls were less frequent the higher I climbed. By mid-morning, the incline steepened and the trail narrowed, passing over slick rocks and around large boulders covered in moss. My legs were strong, my pack light enough, and I felt the familiar mix of fatigue and exhilaration that hiking always gave me. As I moved higher, the trees thinned, and the landscape opened up. Jagged cliffs began to loom on one side, and valleys stretched out far below. The air became crisper, thinner. I stopped periodically to catch my breath, drink water, and take in the scenery. There was no one around, and I liked it that way. By noon, I reached the ridge I had aimed for, where the view was almost vertical, a sheer drop into the misty gorge below. It was breathtaking and terrifying at the same time, and I had to be careful with every step. The rocks were loose, and the wind gusted unpredictably. I moved slowly, using my trekking poles for extra stability. I had planned to descend on the other side of the ridge to a small plateau that the map marked as flat and suitable for camping. It should have been an easy, though steep, path, but as I began the descent, I realized the trail had eroded almost completely in some places. Loose stones rolled under my boots, and the incline was sharper than I had anticipated. I was already tired, but I had to push on. A few times, I had to sit down and rest on large rocks to steady my nerves. The sun was shifting toward late afternoon, and I could feel the temperature dropping. By the time I reached what I thought was the plateau, the wind had picked up significantly, strong enough to make walking tricky. I set up my small tent in the only area that seemed level enough, with rocks piled around the edges to prevent it from blowing away. I drank water and ate a few energy bars, trying to keep my energy up because I had a long day ahead tomorrow. Night came quickly in these high mountains, and it was colder than I expected. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but the wind howling around the tent kept me tense. Every time the tent flapped or a rock rolled down the slope, I jumped. I forced myself to relax, telling myself that the sounds were just the wind, the rocks, the forest settling. Morning arrived gray and windy. I packed up quickly, ate a small breakfast, and began the next stage of my hike, which was meant to be the longest. A traverse along a ridge that, according to the map, would eventually lead me to a river and a trail out of the mountains. The ridge was narrow, only a few feet wide in some spots, with sheer drops on either side. Loose scree made footing uncertain. I felt the adrenaline rush of danger, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every motion. I moved slowly, testing each foothold, careful not to dislodge rocks that could roll down the slope. About halfway along the ridge, I stepped on a patch of wet moss that I didn't see until it was too late. My left foot slipped, and I tumbled down a short slope, hitting the ground hard. My pack absorbed some of the impact, but I felt a sharp pain in my left ankle. I sat still for a moment, breathing hard, trying to assess the damage. The ankle swelled quickly, and I realized I couldn't put my full weight on it. Panic began to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had some supplies: tape, a bandage, and a small splint I had brought for emergencies. I managed to wrap the ankle as best as I could and fashion a crude support with a piece of broken trekking pole. I realized that descending the ridge would now be extremely difficult. If I fell, I could easily slide down hundreds of feet. Turning back was equally treacherous because I would have to retrace the section I had just crossed, and it would put all my weight on the injured ankle. I considered staying put and waiting for help, but I had no cell service. No one knew exactly where I was, and it could be hours or days before anyone might find me. I ate another energy bar, drank water, and forced myself to think rationally. The only option that seemed remotely safe was to move slowly, one careful step at a time, leaning on the trekking poles and my rope for balance. The next 2 hours were grueling. Every step was calculated, every move was slow. My muscles ached, my ankle throbbed, and my hands blistered from gripping the poles and rope. I kept my head down, focusing on the immediate ground in front of me, forcing myself not to look down the cliff edges. I noticed how thin the air was making me lightheaded and dizzy, but I pushed through, determined not to stop. The sun was climbing higher, and I knew I had to reach lower ground before evening, or I would be exposed to freezing temperatures again. Finally, I reached a small ledge that seemed more stable, a section of trail wide enough to move without risking a fall. I rested there for several minutes, eating, drinking, and letting the adrenaline subside. I studied the map again and realized that if I could reach a certain bend in the ridge, there was a sheltered ravine below where I could make a safer camp. It would require descending about 100 feet on loose rock, but it was my only chance to survive the day without more serious injury. I tested each foothold, moving slowly and deliberately, lowering myself down hand over hand, using the rope tied around my waist for security. My heart pounded, my fingers scraped on rock, and dirt slid down with me, but eventually, I reached the bottom. The ravine was narrow and protected from the wind. I set up the tent with rocks around it, dug a shallow trench to prevent water from pooling, and collapsed inside, exhausted. My ankle throbbed, my muscles burned, and my hands were raw, but I was alive. I ate another meal, drank water, and forced myself to rest, telling myself I would start again at first light. The next morning, I woke to fog filling the ravine. The visibility was minimal, but the air was calm. I inspected my ankle and realized that it was swelling more, and movement was difficult, but I could still put some weight on it. I decided I needed to move toward the river shown on the map, which was a few miles downstream. It would be slow, dangerous travel over loose rocks, fallen trees, and wet earth, but I had no choice. Over the next several hours, I crawled, limped, and used my poles to keep myself balanced. At one point, I nearly slipped on a moss-covered rock and fell into the shallow water of a stream. I was soaked, chilled, and shivering, but I forced myself to stand, wrap my wet clothes around me as best I could, and continue. Every muscle in my body ached. Every step was agony, but I knew I couldn't stop. My mind focused entirely on moving forward, putting one foot in front of the other. By late afternoon, I finally saw the river. It was small, not deep, but it marked the beginning of a proper trail I could follow. The riverbank was muddy and slippery, but I found a route along fallen logs and rocks that allowed me to move with caution. As I progressed, I realized that the sun was sinking quickly, and I had to find a place to camp. I spotted a flat patch of dirt next to a stand of trees a few hundred feet away from the river and staggered toward it. Exhausted, I set up my tent, wrapped myself in every layer I had, and ate what little food remained. That night, for the first time since my ankle injury, I felt some relief because I knew I was on the correct path and that if I could keep moving tomorrow, I would reach the main trailhead in safety. The following day, I moved slowly along the river trail, using my poles and the rope for support. The terrain was still rough, with fallen trees, rocks, and occasional mud pits, but at least it was a clear route. I rested frequently, drinking water from the river after using my portable filter. By midday, I reached a junction marked on my map as leading to a main forest road. The thought of civilization was a relief. I had been planning this hike for weeks, ever since I found that old map tucked away in a corner of my backpacking guidebook. The trail wasn't famous, and it barely appeared in online forums or GPS apps. I liked it that way. I liked trails where there weren't crowds, where the air smelled of pine and dirt, and the quiet wasn't filled with the chatter of other hikers. This one promised a full day of isolation, rugged terrain, and the kind of challenge that made my legs ache just thinking about it. The morning I left, the sun was a dull orange, just above the horizon, spilling light over the dewy fields that led to the forest edge. I felt the familiar thrill of stepping into the unknown. The first few miles were easy. The path was narrow, just a single dirt track, bordered by thick underbrush. The forest was alive in a subtle way. The wind stirred the tops of the trees, a few birds called out, and the distant sound of a creek running over stones made the silence feel less oppressive. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, but I reminded myself it was just the extra water, food, and emergency gear. I tried to keep my pace steady, conscious not to tire myself too quickly. The early light painted the forest in gold and green, making everything seem vibrant and alive, but I also noticed the shadows stretching between the trees, dark and deep, and my stomach tightened with a sense of small unease. Not fear, not yet, just a cautious awareness that I was entirely alone. About 3 hours in, the trail became steeper. Roots twisted out of the ground like veins, and stones jutted sharply, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. I started to sweat despite the cool morning air. My legs ached more than I expected, and I realized I might have underestimated the difficulty of this trail. I paused often, leaning on my trekking poles, listening to the forest. It was still quiet, but there was a change in the atmosphere. The birdsong had almost disappeared. Even the wind seemed softer, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I told myself it was just normal for deeper forests to feel still, but a small part of me felt a creeping tension, a subtle awareness that there was something about this place I couldn't name. By mid-morning, I reached a ridge with a view of the valley below. The drop was sharp, and the trees thinned enough to reveal the rocky slopes leading down. I took a long break there, drinking water and eating a small snack. I kept my eyes on the path I had come from, noting its twists and the way the sun cast shadows through the branches. It looked peaceful from above, almost serene, but there was a weight in the air I couldn't shake. Something about the isolation pressed in on me, and I realized how vulnerable I was. If I slipped, fell, or got injured, there would be no one for miles to notice. That thought made my stomach churn. I shook it off and focused on the next part of the trail, which dropped sharply into a dense thicket. The descent was tricky. Loose gravel made every step precarious, and I had to place my feet carefully to avoid sliding. A few times I caught myself leaning heavily on my poles to steady myself. I remember feeling my heart rate rise, not from exertion but from the awareness that a misstep could be disastrous. My legs were trembling when I finally reached the forest floor. The light had shifted by now. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, fragmented beams, illuminating pockets of moss and damp leaves. The forest smelled sharp and earthy, the scent of wet pine and decaying leaves overwhelming. The air was heavier, warmer, and felt almost stagnant. I began to notice the subtle sounds, the snap of a branch somewhere nearby, the rustle of leaves, the occasional scurry of small animals. Each sound felt louder than it should, sharper, closer, even though nothing appeared. Around noon, I realized I had been walking for hours and had not seen another human. The map suggested a small stream somewhere ahead, a good place to refill water and rest. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the forest floor for the glint of water or the subtle sound of rushing currents. The trees grew denser, the path narrower, and the ground was uneven with fallen branches and roots. I had to step carefully or risk twisting an ankle. I started to feel fatigued, my shoulders aching from the backpack. I reminded myself to drink water, to pace myself. The isolation felt heavier now, more pressing. Every time a branch cracked underfoot or a bird called from far away, I flinched slightly, my senses heightened to almost paranoia. I was alert, maybe too alert, the kind of alert that made the hairs on my neck rise. By mid-afternoon, I finally heard water. A low, gurgling sound, far off at first, then louder as I moved closer. I found the stream tucked into a small hollow, surrounded by thick ferns and mossy rocks. I sat on a large stone at the edge, lowering my pack, and leaned over to drink. The water was cold and clear. I filled my bottle, rinsed my face, and allowed myself a moment of relief. It was the first sense of comfort I had felt all day. I took a few deep breaths, feeling the tension in my muscles ease slightly. But then, while drinking, I noticed something. The water wasn't just flowing over rocks. It carried something along with it, debris from the forest floor. There were larger branches, leaves, and something else, a small tangle of fabric. I frowned, leaning closer. It looked like a piece of clothing partially torn and soaked. I felt a chill. Someone or something had been here before me. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a lost hiker or someone's forgotten gear. Still, the thought made me tense. I finished refilling my bottle and left the stream, moving a little faster now, wanting to put more distance between me and the site. The trail grew darker as the day wore on. The canopy thickened, and patches of sunlight became rarer. I noticed that the forest here was different, older, rougher. Trees were gnarled, roots tangled like chains across the path. The soil was softer, damp and dark, making my boots sink slightly with each step. I kept my poles close, using them to feel for stability. My legs were tired, my back ached, but I pressed on. The isolation now felt oppressive. I had been walking for almost 7 hours. My water bottle was half full, and I realized I needed to consider turning back if I didn't find the next landmark soon. I checked the map, trying to locate my position. The trail should have curved near a ridge and descended again, but I could not see any obvious signs. The lines on the map were vague, and I realized that GPS signal on my phone was weak. A pang of unease crept in. If I miscalculated, I could be off the trail entirely. As I walked, the forest floor grew more treacherous. Loose stones, slick patches of moss, and hidden holes forced me to concentrate intensely. I was exhausted, but stopping felt dangerous too. Each pause brought a silence that was almost suffocating. I tried to listen, to detect any sounds of other hikers or wildlife, but all I heard was the occasional drip of water from leaves, the creak of branches in the wind, and my own labored breathing. Hours passed. I couldn't tell exactly how long. I was so focused on keeping my footing that I lost track of time. I began to feel a low, nagging sense of panic. Not fear exactly, but the realization that I might be lost. Every turn I took seemed to bring me back to the same type of twisted roots and dense underbrush. Nothing looked familiar. The ridge I expected was nowhere in sight. My map was useless. My phone offered only a faint, flickering GPS that moved inconsistently. The panic grew heavier with each step, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking in a forest like this would be disastrous. Eventually, I came to a clearing. I could see a small rock outcrop in the distance, jagged and rough, a landmark that seemed significant. I forced my legs to move faster, climbing the incline to reach it. The climb was steep and treacherous, my hands scraping against stone and bark to stabilize myself. I stopped halfway, exhausted, but finally made it to the top. From there, I could see further than I had all day. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. The sunlight was fading, casting long shadows that darkened quickly. But there, in the distance, I noticed a faint glimmer. A road, maybe, or a path leading out of the forest. I felt a surge of hope. It was far, but it was something tangible. I could leave this endless maze of trees behind. I descended carefully, using every ounce of focus to avoid missteps. By now, the light was dimming, and the temperature was dropping. I hugged the edges of the slope, looking for signs of the path I had seen from the rock. My legs screamed in protest, but I ignored it, knowing the forest night could be cruel. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of a narrow dirt track. I knew immediately it was the road I had glimpsed from above. Relief washed over me in a tangible way. I checked my map again, aligning it with the faint road, confirming that if I followed it downhill, I would reach civilization. My pace quickened, every step lighter now that I felt a direction. I had been planning this hike for weeks. Not just any hike, but a long, solitary trek into a remote section of the mountains that few people went to. I had maps, a compass, a GPS device, extra food, water, and all the gear I thought I would need. I wanted isolation, a chance to disconnect from everything and just be in the mountains with my thoughts. I had done hikes before, longer ones, but nothing as isolated as this. The trailhead started at a small parking area off a barely paved road, the kind where a broken-down pickup might sit for days without anyone noticing. I arrived early in the morning, just as the sun was rising, casting a pale orange light over the trees and the mist still hanging low over the valley. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. It was crisp, clean, and cold, making me glad I had packed my layers. I started walking slowly, taking my time. The path was overgrown in some places, rocks and tree roots making the footing tricky. The trail climbed steadily, first through dense forests of spruce and fir, the ground soft with fallen needles. Every now and then, I stopped to check my map and make sure I was on the correct path. My plan was to hike up a ridge that ran parallel to a small creek and then follow it to a high clearing where I intended to camp for the night. I was alone and I liked it that way. The forest was quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional bird call, and the crunch of my boots against the dirt. After a few hours, I reached the creek. It was narrower than I expected, shallow in places, with clear water running over smooth stones. I took off my pack and sat on a fallen log to eat a small snack. I could see my breath in the cold air, and the sun was higher now, illuminating the forest in golden light. After a brief rest, I refilled my water bottle from the creek, careful to filter the water before drinking it, and set off again. The trail began to climb more steeply, winding up the ridge. My legs were starting to tire, my thighs and calves aching from the incline. I had to stop more often, leaning on my trekking poles to catch my breath. By late afternoon, the forest began to thin, and I could see the ridge stretching ahead of me, rocky and exposed. The wind picked up as I climbed, chilling me through my layers. I paused at a flat rock to look back over the valley. The view was incredible. I could see the winding road where I had started, the tiny speck of my car far below. The mountains stretched in every direction, jagged and imposing, their peaks dusted with the remnants of winter snow. I felt small but alive, a mix of awe and exhaustion washing over me. I decided to keep going until I found a suitable place to camp. I wanted to reach the high clearing before dark, so I pushed myself harder, climbing carefully over loose rocks and fallen trees. The trail was becoming less defined, and I had to navigate more carefully, using the map, compass, and GPS to stay on course. As the afternoon faded into evening, shadows lengthened in the forest, and the temperature dropped sharply. I pulled on my jacket and gloves, feeling the cold bite through me. Finally, I reached a small clearing atop the ridge. It was perfect for camping. Flat, sheltered by large boulders from the wind, with a view over the valley. I set down my pack and began to set up my tent. The wind was strong, but the boulders blocked most of it. I pitched the tent as quickly as I could, my hands stiff and cold. Inside, I arranged my sleeping bag and gear, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible. The sky was darkening fast, turning from deep blue to black. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then bright and countless, a massive expanse of white pinpricks against the void. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, the smell of rice and beans filling the tiny tent. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food, the satisfaction of being entirely alone in a beautiful, remote place. After cleaning up, I climbed into my sleeping bag, thinking about the next day's route. I planned to follow the ridge further north, then descend into a dense forested valley to reach a small lake where I would rest and refill my water. I felt tired but satisfied. Night fell completely, and with it came a deep, unnatural silence. Even the wind had died down. I lay awake for a while, listening. At first, I only heard the normal sounds, the occasional rustle of a small animal, the distant drip of water, the whisper of wind through the rocks. But then I noticed something different. There was a faint snapping sound, like a branch breaking under a heavy step. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But then the sound came again, closer this time. My heart began to beat faster. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I was in a wilderness area, and the only creatures nearby were animals. But something about the rhythm of the steps made me uneasy. I zipped up the tent and sat inside, straining to hear. The steps stopped for a while, then started again, slower this time, deliberate. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold. My mind began to race. I checked the edges of the clearing, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. I could hear breathing, or maybe I imagined it, shallow and controlled. I grabbed my small flashlight and held it ready, shining it toward the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing there. Time stretched, each minute seeming to last forever. My instincts told me to stay put, to make no sudden movements, to avoid making noise. I remembered all the advice I had read about encounters in the wilderness. Stay calm, make yourself visible, avoid confrontation if possible. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, gnawed at me. Hours passed this way, the snapping sounds coming and going, never predictable, never leaving me entirely at ease. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted. My nerves were raw, every sound amplified in my ears. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The clearing was empty. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. I felt a wave of relief, but it was cautious, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. I packed my gear quickly, eager to leave. My hands shook from tension and fatigue. I started down the ridge carefully, my eyes scanning constantly. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant sound put me on edge. I tried to focus on the trail, on the map, on my goal. I reminded myself to keep calm, to keep steady, to avoid panic. Step by step, I moved through the forest, climbing over roots and rocks, my heart still racing from the night before. Around mid-morning, I reached a small stream. I knelt down to drink, and while my hands were in the water, I noticed footprints in the soft mud. They were large, human, and recent. My stomach sank. I had been alone, or thought I was. The prints indicated someone else had been in this area, perhaps following the same trail, perhaps lingering in places I had rested. I studied them carefully. They were fresh, the edges soft but defined. Whoever had made them had been walking heavily, deliberately. Panic started to rise in my chest. I had to think. I had no cell service, no way to call for help. I could only rely on myself. I decided to move quickly but carefully, trying not to make a sound. I followed the stream for a while, using it as a guide toward a lower, more open area I knew was ahead. The forest was thicker here, making the path difficult. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to stay rational. By early afternoon, I reached the edge of a small meadow. The sunlight was warm and almost comforting after hours in dense forest. I paused to rest, to drink water, and to gather my thoughts. The meadow was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension of the ridge and the clearing. I tried to let myself relax for a moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I scanned the treeline, the distant hills, the forest beyond. Nothing. Still, I moved on, keeping to the path I knew would lead me to the lake. The descent into the valley was slow and treacherous. The ground was steep, littered with loose stones and fallen branches. I had to keep my balance, using my poles and carefully placing each foot. The forest here was dense, the light dim even at midday. The air smelled damp and earthy, with the faint scent of decaying leaves. I could hear small animals moving through the underbrush, and I stayed alert for any larger creatures. My pace was steady but cautious. Finally, by late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was a small, clear body of water, tucked away in a natural depression surrounded by trees. The surface was calm, reflecting the sky above. I collapsed on a flat rock at the edge, exhausted and tense. I drank water, ate some of my remaining food, and rested. The lake was peaceful, and the fear that had gripped me since the previous night began to ease.